नाजरीन, प्रोग्राम दुनिया की राय में खुशामदीद। मैं हूं अज़र फ़तेह, आम ज़बान में मुझे अली के नाम से जाना जाता है, और मेरे साथ पहले की तरह मौजूद हैं मुज़म्मिल अनवार। नाजरीन, यमन में पिछले साल एक 13 साला शहरी बरतानवी अशारिये द गार्डियन से बातचीत करते हुए कहता है कि अमरीकी ड्रोन स्ट्राइक्स ने उसके मुल्क को एक जहन्नुम बना डाला है, जहां पर वो दिन रात अपनी ज़िंदगी की फ़िक्र करता है। 2011 में उसके वालिद और भाई को उस वक्त एक ड्रोन स्ट्राइक ने मार डाला जब वो अपना ऊँटों का रेवड़ संभाल रहे थे, और फिर इस साल जनवरी में तोइमान को भी गलती से एक दहशतगर्द समझकर एक ड्रोन स्ट्राइक ने हलाक कर दिया। नाजरीन, उस वक्त का यमन तोइमान के लिए तो एक जहन्नुम था, पर आज के यमन से बहुत मुख्तलिफ। उस वक्त 1 लाख से जायद यमनी शहरी अंदरूनी नकल मकानी यानी इंटरनल डिस्प्लेसमेंट पर मजबूर न थे, और उस वक्त सऊदी और दूसरे मुसलमान मुल्कों की हवाई बमबारी की वजह से 1500 से करीब लोग यमन में हलाक नहीं हुए थे। लेकिन आज की यमन की सूरत हाल बहुत मुख्तलिफ है। हर तरफ बमबारी है, पाकिस्तान ने अपने शहरी वहाँ से निकाल लिए हैं, और भी बहुत सारे दूसरे मुल्कों ने अपने शहरी वहाँ से निकाल लिए हैं या निकाले जा रहे हैं। आखिर यमन इस तरह की नाजुक सूरत हाल पर किस तरह पहुँचा? आज इस मौजू पर बात करने के लिए हमारे साथ बरतानिया से मौजूद हैं बरतानवी तज्ज़िया निगार मार्कस पापाडोपोलोस। मार्कस एक बरतानिया में एक पॉलिटिकल मैगज़ीन पॉलिटिक्स फर्स्ट के लिए काम करते हैं, लिखते हैं, मुदीर हैं वहाँ पर। Marcus, before I go on to you, I would just like to ask you, how did we reach this situation in Yemen, where we have 1,500 people killed and more than 100,000 people internally displaced?
Well, if I can answer your question in short, it is because America is once again attempting to cement its leading position in the Middle East by using one of its staunchest allies in the world, Saudi Arabia. That's what this conflict ultimately is about. The American government has given the Saudi government a blank check to militarily intervene in Yemen and to put down a resistance movement which is very, very close to Iran. And the Americans are concerned that if the Houthi rebels are successful in Yemen, then Iran will have increased its influence in the Middle East. So the Americans have, as I said, given a blank check to Saudi Arabia to carry out a brutal, heartless military campaign in Yemen, and it's all about maintaining America's supremacy in the Middle East.
But wasn't it President Hadi who requested the Saudi government, Saudis are of course partners of President Hadi, to intervene in his country after there was a civil war?
Yes, he did. But once again, there is no higher law in this world than the United Nations Security Council. I've heard this argument put out that if a government in exile requests foreign intervention in
which by
country,
the way is part of the United Nations Security Council law, if I'm correct.
Yes, but it has not been discussed by the United Nations Security Council. It hasn't been voted on by the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council has not given its consent for Saudi Arabia to embark on a military campaign, and it's very important to make that point. And if there was legality to the argument that the Yemeni president has asked for foreign intervention and it's legal, then the same should be said about Syria. The Syrian government, therefore, has every right to call upon, for example, Russia to start launching military strikes against the Islamist militants that are fighting against the Syrian government. Now, you certainly wouldn't have America accepting that argument. You certainly wouldn't have Saudi Arabia accepting that argument. But as I said, ultimately, there is no law higher than the United Nations Security Council. And if the Security Council does not give its go-ahead to military intervention, then military intervention which is taken is illegal. Saudi Arabia is acting illegally at the moment.
So for the Americans to say that they are now Americans have funded $500 million to the Yemeni government in military aid. And they say it's because we want to avoid any attacks on the West by the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is primarily residing within Yemen. So are they not right? I mean, are they not right to support their allies in the region so that they can prevent attacks in their home country?
Well, certainly there is an there is a heavy Al-Qaeda presence in Yemen, and that is very, very worrying. And the Houthi rebels detest Al-Qaeda, and they are fighting against Al-Qaeda. But there's some irony here. When America talks about Al-Qaeda and the danger of Al-Qaeda, well, let's be frank about it. If there was no Saudi Arabia, there wouldn't be an Al-Qaeda in the world today. Let's not forget that that the roots of Al-Qaeda was laid during the war, during the Soviet-Afghan war in the 1980s, when the Americans were spending hundreds of millions of dollars back in the Mujahideen, and Saudi Arabia played a pivotal role in supporting the Mujahideen. It was Saudi Arabia that in effect gave birth to Al-Qaeda. So it's quite rich, it's quite ironic for the Americans to warn about Al-Qaeda when the role of Saudi Arabia in the context of Al-Qaeda and in the context of Islamist terrorism is very, very suspect. You know, we can take the terrible terrorist attacks in Washington and New York, and you know, there's a signpost pointing all the way back to Saudi Arabia. So yes, there's a very dangerous presence of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. The Houthi rebels know this. That's why they're attacking them. But quite frankly, I wouldn't tolerate the arguments that Saudi Arabia has a clear argument against Islamic extremism and Al-Qaeda. No, not whatsoever. Ask ordinary people in Syria what they think about Saudi Arabia, and they will connect them to Al-Qaeda, and they will connect them to other terrorist groups.
I mean, I would say ask anyone in Pakistan or even in India. India is a big ally of America. And after the Mumbai attacks, even before the Mumbai attacks, most of the Indian media were publishing reports that most of the militant Islamic organizations working in their country are funded by Saudi Arabia. So I don't know. I don't understand why doesn't the American media bashes on Saudi Arabia just like it bashes on Russia or on Pakistan? What is the reason? Why is America in bed with Saudi Arabia when we all know that Saudis are the one funding militant Islam all over the world?
Well, I agree with you 100%. And the question you ask is a very, very pertinent question. Well, look, you know, Saudi Arabia is a staunch strategic ally to America. Why? Because number one, Saudi Arabia is the leading country in the world in the production of oil, and secondly, Saudi Arabia allows America to be the foreign dominant player in the Middle East. So even though Saudi Arabia is in effect a dictatorship and has a horrendous record when it comes to human rights abuses, the Americans and the American government and the American media will ignore that, because what's more important to the Americans is that Saudi Arabia allows America to be the #1 player in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia, of course, is very important to America because of the oil. And you make a very interesting point about the American media. Well, the American media, and let's just say Western mainstream media in general, is not independent. It's very much part of the policy-making process in Washington, for example, in London. So the American media is not going to expose the role of Saudi Arabia, as you say, for example, in India, because exposing Saudi Arabia would be exposing one of America's staunchest allies and friends in the world. You know, American media, if
Marcus, if I may, extremism is a reality in Muslim countries. I'm from Pakistan. I grew up over there, albeit I lived a major chunk of my life outside Pakistan, but still, extremism is a reality in many Muslim countries. Isn't America right to say that, America does face a very viable threat from Muslim countries?
Well, not from Muslim countries, from radical Muslims. We need to be clear about this.
That is true.
That is true. Islamism is not Islam. They're two very separate things. Does America face a threat from radical Muslims, from Islamists? Yes, it does. But they have brought this threat on themselves and on the entire world as well. The Americans work with Islamists when it suits them, and it fights against them when it doesn't suit them. So, for example, they were battling the Taliban in Afghanistan because it didn't suit because it suited American interests. If we have a look in Libya in 2011, the Americans gave the go-ahead to France and Britain to fight alongside Islamists to overthrow the legitimate government of Muammar Gaddafi. Whatever people thought of Gaddafi, he was the legitimate leader of the country, but nonetheless they teamed up with Islamists to overthrow him. And let's not forget the Benghazi courthouse where the so-called revolution began from. By the end of 2011, it was flying the Al-Qaeda flag. If we turn to Syria, the Americans are once again backing Islamists in order to overthrow the Syrian government. Why? Because the Syrian government is an arch enemy of Israel. The Syrian government pursues an independent foreign policy, and Syria is very close to Russia and Iran, politically speaking. So yes,
Marcus, we will come back to this topic of Syria, Russia, and other countries currently involved in the Yemen crisis. I would like to play a video where Obama declares their strategy in Yemen last year. President Obama declared their strategy in Yemen a success story. I would like to play that video right now and then come back to you, Marcus, and ask you what is happening in Yemen right now and what is the cause behind the recent crisis.
Over the last several years, we have consistently taken the fight to terrorists who threaten our country. We took out Osama bin Laden and much of al-Qaeda's leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've targeted al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen and recently eliminated the top commander of its affiliate in Somalia. This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist using our air power and our support for partners' forces on the ground. This strategy of taking out terrorists who threaten us while supporting partners on the front lines is one that we have successfully pursued in Yemen and Somalia for years, and it is consistent with the approach I outlined earlier this year: to use force against anyone who threatens America's core interests, but to mobilize partners wherever possible to address broader challenges to international order.
Marcus, I don't know which success story is Obama talking about. Yemen is in a complete mess right now. Before I go on to you, I need a sort of a rundown from you of what's happening in Yemen right now. I would like to involve our co-analyst Muzammil. Muzammil, what do you say about the entire Yemen situation?
I agree with Marcus. U.S. is fully involved in the war. You mentioned that we gave $500 million to the Yemenis, but we just made a deal with the Saudis and we've been delivering on it. We've sold them $60 billion worth of weapons.
And this is happening while America is talking with Iran for a nuclear deal. So on one hand, America is funding the Yemeni government, the Saudi government, and on the other hand, America is also in talks with Iran for a nuclear deal, Muzammil.
Right, and we've not just sold them weapons. We're training their fighters. We're providing them with intelligence, and basically we are fully involved in that war. And the other thing is, Hadi was installed by Saudi and US's involvement, and he does not represent the people of Yemen. The reason there's a conflict there is because people did not want him. Houthis, they're a minority, and they rose up for their rights. When we talk about these arguments, and I really don't like using democracy and Saudi Arabia in the same sentence because they're,
So for you, it's a conflict of interest, not a conflict of values, not a conflict of religion.
Exactly.
Let me go back to Marcus.
We've been installing dummies there.
Let me go back to Marcus. And Marcus, if you can tell us what is happening in Yemen right now.
Well, what we can see in Yemen at the moment is a brutal conflict, and it's a brutal conflict which, quite frankly, is not receiving the media coverage that it should. How many innocent civilians have died in about a month and a half of Saudi Arabia's aerial campaign? How many innocent civilians have been maimed for life? How many innocent civilians are being terrified every single day? And the gentleman in your studio, I agree with him 100%. This has got nothing to do with democracy. This is all about geostrategic politics. Look, America is claiming that a legitimate government has been forced out, and therefore it is in line with international law for America and Saudi Arabia to come to the rescue of that government. That, in a nutshell, is what they're saying. Well, if that is, if that's the case, what about Ukraine? At the beginning of 2014, a legitimate government, which was recognized by the Americans, was forced out of power. Did the Americans come to the aid of that government, i.e. Viktor Yanukovych? No, they didn't. They sided with the opposition. So quite frankly, it's absolute nonsense for the Americans to cite democracy when it comes to Yemen. No, it's not. It's about what's best for America's interest. In Ukraine, it served America's interest for the legitimate government to be overthrown. In Yemen, it serves the interests of the Americans for the government of Hadi to remain in power, and for the Houthi resistance to be eliminated.
You mentioned a very important point about Ukraine. Many people argue that Viktor Yanukovych, my apologies if I'm not pronouncing his name right, but many people argue that he didn't enjoy legitimization in the West, but actually he did. In 2010, after becoming president, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited Kiev and was received by Viktor himself. And then in 2012, on the sidelines of the nuclear summit in South Korea, Viktor Yanukovych had a chat with Obama on the sidelines of that summit. So he definitely had a legitimization in the West. His government, when he was prime minister of the country in 2002 or 2003, was the one that sided with the America on the war in Iraq, the attack on Iraq. So he definitely had a very big level of legitimization in the West. Let me just take a break over here. Marcus, after the break, we'll come back and discuss if this is a sectarian conflict in Yemen, or is this a fight for more political control within two different factions. नाजरीन, ब्रेक के बाद खुश आमदीद। मैं आपको बताता चलूँ कि यमन में हालिया खाना जंगी या हालिया जंग किस तरह शुरू हुई। 2000 अक्सर एनालिस्ट का ये कहना है कि जब 2004 में हूथी बागियों के लीडर को हलाक कर दिया गया गवर्नमेंट फोर्सेस ने। हूथी बागी का लीडर उस वक्त गवर्नमेंट के ख़िलाफ़ बहुत सारे प्रोटेस्ट डेमोन्स्ट्रेशंस करवा रहे थे। गवर्नमेंट ने उन पे ये इंसाइटमेंट का इल्ज़ाम लगा के उनको मार दिया। उस वक्त से हूथी बागी हुकूमत के सिस्टम के अंदर रह के अपने लिए पॉलिटिकल कंट्रोल मांग रहे हैं। लेकिन पिछले साल उनकी जो कार्रवाई थी उसमें तेज़ी आ गई उस वक्त जब मौजूदा जो हादी की हुकूमत थी, उन्होंने इनके जो ऑब्जेक्टिव्स थे वो मानने से इनकार कर दिया। तो लगभग सितंबर में हूथी बागियों ने जो यमनी कैपिटल है सना, उस पर अटैक लॉन्च कर दिए। कुछ महीने बाद उन्होंने यमनी कैपिटल यानी सना पर अपना कब्ज़ा जमा लिया और उसके बाद यमन के मुख्तलिफ बड़े शहरों पर हूथी बागियों ने आहिस्ता आहिस्ता गवर्नमेंट फोर्सेस को वहाँ से निकाल कर अपना कब्ज़ा वहाँ पे मजबूत कर लिया। हत्ता कि जो पोर्ट ऑफ एडन है यमन के साउथ में, ये पोर्ट ऑफ एडन को 20वीं सदी का अगर सबसे तरीन नहीं तो एक बहुत मसरूफ़ तरीन पोर्ट माना जाता है, जहाँ से मिलियन बैरल्स की जो तेल की ट्रेड होती है रोज़ाना। अक्सर लोग ये कहते हैं कि ईरान हूथी बागियों को इसलिए सपोर्ट कर रहा है ताकि वो उस पोर्ट ऑफ एडन पे अपना कब्ज़ा जमा सके, जिसके बाद यूरोपी ममालिक हैं उनके लिए बहुत मुश्किल होगा कि वो अमेरिका का साथ दें ईरान के ख़िलाफ़ सैंक्शंस पर, क्योंकि ईरान का एक होल्ड आ जाएगा उस रीजन पर जब वो वहाँ की ट्रेड को रोक सकेगा जो पोर्ट ऑफ एडन के करीब से गुजरती है। तो ये एक यमन में इस वक्त ये सूरत हाल है। कुछ दिन पहले सऊदी अरेबिया ने एक ट्रूस प्रपोज किया था। सऊदी अरेबिया ने आई थिंक 26 मार्च को यमन पर दूसरे मुसलमान मुल्कों के साथ मिलकर, जिसमें इजिप्ट भी शामिल है, वहाँ बमबारी शुरू की। 21 अप्रैल को उन्होंने वो ऑपरेशन जिसका नाम डिसाइसिव स्टॉर्म था वो ख़त्म कर दिया, लेकिन उसके कुछ घंटे बाद एक और ऑपरेशन शुरू किया रिस्टोरिंग होप के नाम से, और उसमें भी शदीद बमबारी यमन पर शुरू कर दी। अब से कुछ घंटे पहले जो यूएन की वहाँ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव हैं, उन्होंने सऊदी अरेबिया से ये कहा कि आपकी जो यमन पर बमबारी है उसके कुछ, अगर पूरी मुकम्मल तौर पे नहीं, लेकिन उसके कुछ एस्पेक्ट जो हैं वो इंटरनेशनल लॉ के ख़िलाफ़ हैं, क्योंकि उसमें मासूम लोगों की बहुत सारी जानें ज़ाया हो रही हैं। हम मार्कस के पास दोबारा जाते हैं। मार्कस, आई विल आस्क यू नाउ, the conflict right now in Yemen, is this a sectarian conflict, or is this a struggle between different political factions for more political power?
I would argue the latter. Look, on the face of it, it would appear that it's a sectarian conflict, i.e. it's another Shia-Sunni conflict. And perhaps it's a factor in this. But in my opinion, the overriding factor to explain this dreadful, appalling conflict is that it's about outside players seeking to bring Yemen under their thumb in order to maintain, safeguard their dominant position in the Middle East. The Americans and the Saudis have embarked on this military aggression against Yemen to keep the Iranians out of Yemen and to weaken Iran's influence in the Middle East, but also as well to stifle Russian influence in Yemen. Let's not forget that Russia, since Soviet times, has had influence in Yemen, and there's nothing wrong with a country having influence in another country. That's perfectly fine, providing it's done in accordance with international law and the mechanisms of the UN. So it's a game of chess that the Americans and the Saudis are playing in the Middle East. And what they're doing in Yemen is very similar to Syria. They're trying to bring down the Syrian government to eliminate Russian influence in the Middle East. And they have embarked on this military campaign in Yemen in order to keep Iranian influence out of the country and Russian influence out of the country. And I'd also add this as well, that I don't believe the Saudi aggression is aimed at the Houthis. It's actually aimed at Yemen, because most people in Yemen, they didn't back President Hadi. I mean, which president in this day and age receives over 80% of the vote in a presidential election? I think it was over 80%, maybe 85% he allegedly received. That's absolute nonsense. No, it's aggression against Yemen. What the Saudis are doing is comparable in some respects to what they did in Bahrain in 2011. They sent their troops into an independent sovereign country to put down a rebellion. No one in the West condemned that, because Saudi Arabia is a staunch strategic ally of the West, and the Saudis are doing it again. And you know, one of the saddest aspects of this conflict is that the richest country in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, is bombing the poorest country in the Middle East, Yemen. I think that's heartbreaking, and I think it's disgraceful how the West has given, in effect, a blank check to Saudi Arabia to carry out this murderous campaign.
So you basically mean Yemen, that any country that has got a considerable people considerable number of Shiites, Saudi Arabia sees that country as a threat. Bahrain has got a very large majority of Shiites in their country. Yemen, almost 45% of people they belong to the Shia religion. So you mean to say that any country with a very large number of Shiites living in it is a threat to Saudi Arabia, because otherwise Saudi Arabia feels that Iran would have its influence on that country?
Yes, I believe that they see that as a threat. But also as well, we need to have a look at the country. And as I said, Yemen has historically close relations with Russia. That's a no-no for America. That's a no-no for Saudi Arabia. And also, Yemen has long-standing relations with Iran. Syria has long-standing relations with Iran. That's a no-no for the Americans and the Saudis. And Syria has a long-standing relationship with Russia. Once again, that's a big no-no for the Americans And the Saudis, if they are to maintain their dominance in the Middle East, they have to ensure that any that dominance, be it in quotation marks,
Muzammil would like to interject, but Muzammil, before we go on to you, viewers, you can call us live. The number is on the screen. आप हमें live call कर सकते हैं और Marcus से, Muzammil से, मुझसे सवाल पूछ सकते हैं. तो please feel free to call us live. Muzammil, interject.
I agree with Marcus. I mean, this is definitely not a sectarian conflict. It's purely political. It's America's interest and America's blue-eyed boy, Saudi Arabia's interest at stake here. Basically,
Muzammil, for Americans to say, many American analysts, the media, the American government, they say that sectarianism is a reality in Muslim countries. We see Shias attacking Sunnis in Pakistan and vice versa, Sunnis attacking Shias in Pakistan and many other Muslim countries. So aren't the Americans right to say that? Not just the Americans, many other European nations would feel the same way.
So sectarianism is a reality, but who has fueled it? Let's go back to the 80s. There was no sectarianism. And I'll give you the example of Pakistan. Had never heard of any issues between Sunnis and Shias. In Iraq, more recently in Iraq, there were several attempts before Shia-Sunni conflict was started because we believed in the policy of dividing and ruling. So it's us, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia that's fueling that sectarianism. And again, it's purely political. Houthis, what I think is they were just looking for
even
the
if
right.
they're fueling sectarianism
Right.
in a Muslim country, in this case Yemen, still it's Muslims killing Muslims. Isn't that? I mean, like, should it be this way? Like, if I can get weapons from a country like Timbuktu, for example, and if I go and kill my, someone who belongs to the same religion as me, I mean, that does not justify the killing if I'm getting support from another country.
But if you keep instigating it, if you keep fueling it, if you keep like in Iraq, there were several attacks that our U.S. soldiers unfortunately attacked the Sunnis. They were blamed on Shias. Shias were attacked. They were blamed on Sunnis. And this was open in the media. If we go back a few years, this was openly talked about in the media. It's not a secret.
So you mean to say that in Iraq, because of the American invasion of Iraq, the infrastructure which was serving both Sunni and Shias,
yes,
that got dismantled, and that created insecurities in minorities living over there. So
Exactly.
then subsequently they had to stand up for their rights, and just you couldn't avoid sectarianism happening in such a country. Marcus, would you agree?
I would 100% agree with what the gentleman just said. No America, no Saudi Arabia, there would be no conflict in Yemen. No America, no Saudi Arabia, there would be no conflict in Syria. There are countries in the world which are very delicate, which have a very sensitive makeup. For example, Libya. For example, Syria. For example, the old Yugoslavia. Now, these three countries were effectively destroyed because the Americans interfered. They undermined these countries, and all chaos broke out in them. The old Yugoslavia went into civil war, but it never would have happened if the Americans had not undermined that country. In Libya, look at Libya at the moment. It's an absolute disaster. The military intervention of the West in that country was a catastrophic disaster for ordinary Libyans. What have the Americans, the British and the French done? Well, they secured the oil and gas fields in Libya, and that's it. They don't care about the rest of the country.
That is such an important point, Marcus, because in 2011, I remember France saying that it's only reasonable for our companies to benefit by the Libyan oil fields. And the Libyan rebels also said in the same year that all the countries supporting them in their war against Gaddafi, whatever we feel about him, in the war against Gaddafi will get priority treatment once they come into power. So it's such an important point that out of this conflict, not just America, but many European countries were taking advantage. Go ahead.
So, the greed for oil always wins. Even now in Libya, the oil wells are controlled by the British, Italians, and French, I believe. So, regardless of the number of people die, the greed for oil always wins. And the greed for self-interest always wins. And that's what's happening in Yemen. We,
Right.
as US, want to make sure that our interests are protected, Saudi's interests are protected, and human lives can go to hell. I mean,
Right, right. Viewers, I would like to remind you once again, you can call us live in the show. You can ask questions to Marcus, Muzammil, myself. Number would be on the screen right now. आप हमें live call कर सकते हैं program पे, या Marcus से, मुझसे, मुजम्मिल से सवालात कर सकते हैं. Marcus, let me go back to my initial point. I still feel that this is a sectarian conflict in Yemen, primarily because if you look at the demographic map of Yemen, 45% of Shia Yemen lives in one part of the country. Literally, there is no like in Pakistan, Shias and Sunnis in many countries, they live together in one locality. That is not the case in Yemen. Yemen, you've got Shias living in one big chunk, and then you've got the Sunnis in the southern part living in one big chunk. So don't you feel that Yemen has failed to introduce certain measures that would increase and encourage harmony within the country? And now that we are facing this crisis situation, the forces that are fighting against each other are able to take advantage of that very weak infrastructure.
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, and I suspect that there is some truth to that. I think we can look in Iraq, where the successive Iraqi governments after the invasion have hardly acted in a way which is conducive to unity within the country between the Shiites and between the Sunnis. And I suspect as well that's very much the case in Yemen. But nevertheless, despite a historic division between Shiites and Sunnis, which is very sad, and it's completely unnecessary. It's very similar to Northern Ireland, the division between Protestants and Catholics. But put that to the side if we can temporarily. If you don't.
And Marcus, I'm sorry to interject. One thing that makes Yemen very interesting is the fact that, according to some research done on Yemen, there are more weapons in the country than there are people. So this is a country which is heavily weaponized, a heavily weaponized society, failing to introduce measures that would increase harmony within the local population. And now that we've got a crisis, everything is falling down the path.
Well, all the more reason then for to never be military intervention in such a delicate country, in such a sensitive country. I mean, military intervention, it is, whenever the West has military intervened somewhere, it has always been a disaster. But you don't do it in a country like Yemen. Far from it. You need to make sure that arms exports to those sort of countries like Yemen are minimal, and you must make sure that countries do not embark on military campaigns in that country, in such a country. It's a recipe. It's a recipe for disaster. So yes, are there divisions in the country? Of course there are. But if you make sure that that country is not built up with arms, if you make sure that that country is not attacked by an aggressive next door neighbor, then you can try and resolve whatever divisions there are in such a country.
Let me go to Muzammil right now. Muzammil, what would you like?
And just want to add to that point. When you install leaderships in these countries that are backed by U.S., Saudi, and you know what, of any other country, when you install leaderships in a country rather than let the locals elect their leaders, this is the result. Right now,
So you mean we should be working within the system, not inviting a foreign-led intervention into the system? I have to take a break.
We should be promoting democracy.
Let me take a break right now. I'll come back from the break and I'll give you the floor to talk. नाज़रीन, अगर इस वक्त एक ब्रेक लेते हैं, ब्रेक के बाद आपसे मुलाकात होती है. नाजरीन, ब्रेक के बाद एक बार फिर आपका खैर मकदम. Muzammil, you were saying something before we went onto break, so please go ahead.
I was saying the best solution to these issues, these conflicts, is let the democracy prevail. I'd like to quote the example of Pakistan here. If it was up to a dictator or one person like Nawaz Sharif, people are saying that he actually committed to sending our military to help Saudi Arabia, but because we are in the process of a democratic government,
because Pakistan has got a very vibrant civil society,
yes,
they were able to pressurize the Nawaz Sharif government.
Exactly, and let's not forget the role of opposition parties here, led by PTI. They played an amazing role. They made sure that sanity prevailed, and we do not send our military to Yemen.
Right, Marcus, let me ask you this question. What do you think of Obama saying last year, we've also played the video, that Yemen is a success story? He said this on 10th of September 2014.
Well, that's just wishful thinking. I mean, if someone honestly believes that Yemen is a success story, then they must be, quite frankly speaking, living on another planet. Yemen has been faced with a very, very serious threat from Al-Qaeda for a number of years now, and on top of that, we've got an air campaign being launched by Saudi Arabia against it. No, it's not a success story. It's an absolute catastrophic disaster. Just like Iraq, it's a disaster there. Afghanistan is a disaster there. But Obama, he has to make those sort of comments because he has to be able to relay the idea to the American public that his foreign policy is working. Now, ordinary people in Yemen know it's not working. Ordinary people in Afghanistan know it's not working. But nonetheless, in the mainstream media in America, like CNN, Fox News, is not exactly going to trip him up when it comes to that. So
let me tell the viewers over here that we contacted the White House. The White House is, of course, the team of President Obama. They declined to comment. They declined to be a part of this show, but they asked us to reach out to the State Department. The State Department, as we all know, manages the foreign policy of America. And the State Department, I had an email exchange with them. They declined to say anything on television. I asked them if they can give us a written statement. They never responded to my request for a written statement because I really wanted someone from the government to at least be part of this program, at least give us something so that we can have the view of the government in this program. So now I have to rely on published literature out there, the interviews that the White House spokesperson Josh Earnest did with MSNBC. And when he was asked over there, what do you think, does Obama still stand by his comments saying that Yemen is a success story? And Josh's response was that we consider Yemen to be a success story. I'm paraphrasing him right now. We consider Yemen to be a success story because we were able to dismantle the terror infrastructure over there. This is Josh Earnest on MSNBC. I'm paraphrasing, I have to say. And the State Department spokesperson, the video is on YouTube. She said that Obama still stands by the statement that he made. I don't understand how can he say that we were able to dismantle the terror infrastructure, or we were able to dismantle a large part of the terror network over there, when now you've got a situation where you have ISIS or ISIL launching their first biggest attack in Yemen. If you remember, I think it was in March, 137 people were killed in a Shia mosque, which the attack was launched by ISIS. Marcus, my question to you is, how do you see, and Saudi Arabia recently, it came out that Saudi Arabia is now training tribesmen from the south of Yemen, training them and launching them back into Yemen to go and fight Houthi forces. So of course we now know Saudis won't be just like they would also be brainwashing them for hating Shiites in the country, creating more of a civil war like situation. Marcus, I would like to ask you this: what do you think Russia has done so far to manage this conflict?
Well, I think Russia has made it very clear at the United Nations that the military campaign is illegal and that it's full of double standards. And I think one of the most refreshing things about the world in 2015, despite all the problems in the world today and the horrors, for example, in Yemen and Syria, is that Russia today is strong. Russia's not the Russia of the 1990s. You know, if the conflict in Syria had erupted in the 1990s when Russia was on its knees, then the Americans would have attacked the Syrian government and the Syrian military by now. So, you know, in regard to Yemen, Russia has made it very clear that it's illegal, and Russia has made it very clear that how the Americans are behaving has nothing
Is Russia
to do
doing anything for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen?
Well, I was just going to come on to that. I mean, look at Russia's role there. The Russian Emergencies Ministry have sent plane after plane to Yemen to take out not just Russians, not just people from the rest of the former Soviet Union, but people from across the world, Americans, British people, French people, etc. So Russia really has been playing a humanitarian role, and I think it's disgraceful how the American government has shown no interest in the safety of its own people in America. You know, I became aware recently that there were some Americans in Yemen who were very concerned, and they contacted the State Department about their predicament, and the State Department reassured them and said to them, just keep on following developments on this page on the internet, or on the web.
Muzammil would like to interject
Marcus,
over here.
we refused to evacuate our citizens from that country. U.S. citizens residing in or visiting Yemen were left at the mercy of these fighters. So yeah, you know, we need to make sure that we stop acting like an oil company who can bully their way into any country that we smell oil in. And we need to make sure that we...
I would just like to mention a point over here. Russia, a few days ago, pointed fingers at America, saying that America is blocking a UN resolution. Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong, that America is blocking a UN resolution that would allow a humanitarian corridor inside Yemen, if I'm correct. Right, and that's I mean, I have to say this as a journalist. My responsibility is to give all the different views on one story. I have to say this, that is in contrast to what Russia did when America was asking a humanitarian corridor in Syria. Finally, I would just like to ask you and Marcus both: what can anyone do? Anyone who is part of this conflict do to improve the situation? Marcus, first of all, you.
Well, first of all, there's got to be a cessation, a permanent cessation of Saudi Arabia's military campaign against Yemen. That is absolutely critical. And unless Saudi Arabia stops its bloody campaign against Yemen, all other efforts will just be futile. So firstly, there's got to be an end to the attacks. Secondly, neighboring countries, of course, and countries from outside the Middle East, they have to try and bring about a new infrastructure in Yemen. They've got to make sure that the people of Yemen, they vote in free and fair elections.
Right,
and they vote
right. Let me go to Muzammil now. Muzammil, go ahead.
I agree with Marcus. First step is to make sure that we end the conflict right away, and the Saudi needs to stop killing Yemenis. Second thing is, countries with any influence need to make sure that we bring the stakeholders on the table, and I'm talking about the people of Yemen rather than the foreign powers. We need to make sure that they sit on a table and they decide the course that they want to take, and they decide.
प्रोड्यूसर मैं अपने प्रोड्यूसर साहब से रिक्वेस्ट करूंगा, अगर वो मैप इस वक्त टीवी पे डाल सकें जो मैंने मैप दिया था आपको. मैं नाजरीन को कुछ बताना चाहूँगा कि यमन खुद से क्या कर सकता है इस सिचुएशन को फ्यूचर में فیوچر میں اوائڈ کرنے کے لیے. ناظرین یہ جو میپ ابھی آپ ٹی وی پہ اپنے دیکھ رہے ہیں, یہاں پر یہ جو یلو ٹیریٹری ہے یہاں پر یمنی شیعیٹس رہتے ہیں, اور جو ہری ٹیریٹری ہے ان دا ساؤتھ یہاں پر یمنی سنیز رہتے ہیں. یمن ایک ایسی کنٹری ہے جہاں پر لٹرلی شیعہ اور سنی کی کوئی میوچول کوہیشن نہیں ہے. کوئی وہ یہ پاکستان کے اس طرح کے علاقے نہیں ہیں جہاں پر شیعہ اور سنی ایک ہی علاقے میں رہتے ہیں, ایک ہی آبادی میں رہتے ہیں, ان کی آپس میں شادیاں ہوئی ہوئی ہیں. یہ ایک یونیک طرح کا ملک ہے. تو اگر یمن کو سیکٹیرین کانفلکٹ اپنے فیوچر میں اگر آپ کو اپنے آپ کو بچانا ہے کسی بھی طرح کے سیکٹیرین کانفلکٹ سے, تو یمنی حکومت کو پرائیورٹی بیسس پر یہ سوچنا ہوگا کہ کس طرح اپنے ملک کے ڈیموگرافکس کو وہ چینج کر سکیں تاکہ ان کے ایک ہی طرح کے یمنی آپس میں ایک دوسرے کو جان سکیں, ایک دوسرے کو سمجھ سکیں, ایک دوسرے کے ساتھ رہ سکیں. مارکس, تھینک یو سو مچ فار بینگ پارٹ آف دا شو. مزمل, سیم ٹو یو ایز ویل. اینڈ آخر میں ناظرین امید ہے کہ آپ سماجی ذرائع یعنی سوشل میڈیا پر اپنی رائے سے ہمیں آگاہ کریں گے. اپنا, گھر والوں کا, سب کا رنگ, نسل, طبقہ اور خاص کر مذہب کی تفریق کے بغیر خیال رکھیے گا. جلد ملاقات ہوگی.